the Baen Free Radio Hour.
Hello and welcome to the Baen Free Radio Hour. Today, Dave Butler interviews Stephen R. Lawhead on his Arthurian fantasy series, The Pendragon Cycle. In addition, we continue with the last chapter of Wen Spencer's Tinker, Part 84.
Welcome to the Baen Free Radio Hour. This is Dave Butler. I'm here today with Stephen R. Lawhead to talk about the Pendragon cycle that Baen is reprinting. We'll come back later and talk to you about the exciting prequel that we're also putting out for the first time. Let me tell you briefly first about Steve. Stephen R. Lawhead is a multi-award-winning author of mythic history and imaginative bestsellers. In over 30 years of professional writing, he has established an international reputation and is known for such works as the King Raven trilogy, a retelling of the Robin Hood legend, and the Pendragon cycle, an historic retelling of the King Arthur legend. Other notable books include the historical works Byzantium, Patrick, Avalon, fantasy series The Song of Albion and the Dragon King trilogy, as well as works of science fiction Dream Thief and Empyrean, and the 5-book series Bright Empires. Lawhead makes his home in Oxford, England with his wife. You can find out more by visiting www.stephenlawhead.com, no initial R there, I guess, or visit him on Facebook at Stephen R. Lawhead. Steve, welcome to the Baen Free Radio Hour.
Well, thank you very much. That was very nice of you to say all that.
Oh yeah, my pleasure. I'm quite interested to hear about this. I will tell you something about me. My next book out is actually a bit of nonfiction called The Politically Incorrect Guide to Science Fiction and Fantasy. And it was interesting to me as I was doing the research for the book to see how often King Arthur came up. Whether it was T.H. White or Marion Zimmer Bradley or Tim Powers, this has been one of the sort of wells that fantasy keeps returning to. What now? Obviously, you've done a lot of sort of sounds like historical and also sort of British myth or British. I don't know. Robin Hood's not a myth exactly. Legend, popular consciousness kind of figure. But tell me what interests you about Arthur? What brought you to write about Arthur?
Well, I think I should say, growing up as a kid in Nebraska, the Great Plains, the knights in shining armor were about as far away from that as you could get. I mean, I have relatives that actually first house was a sod house out on the prairie, sort of thing, you know. So I think I was just fascinated by all the glamour and the glitter and the lure of legends. You know, drew me, and part of it was because it was so foreign to any kind of experience that I had growing up, and had this kind of exotic uh, nature that seemed really, really well, just really intriguing. Yeah, but I grew up reading lots of science fiction, and Robert Heinlein was one of my early heroes. I remember, going in the library and just sitting on the floor, pulling out Robert Heinlein books and reading them in the library on the floor. Till he told me to, check it out or get out, sort of thing. But the that kind of storytelling, I guess, came to me quite early. But there was the other aspect of it was just the wanderlust, I guess you'd call it. Being in one of the benefits, if they call it that, from growing up on the prairie is that everywhere else is something interesting. And so, and England had some sort of loose family connection with my mother's side of the family. They'd come from England, and we heard stories about the old country and all that. So there was kind of this kind of itch to see what that was like. And was following a trip over as soon as my wife and I were young married people, and as soon as we could afford it, we did a quick trip to England, and I just saw that there is so much more here than I ever imagined. And
Mm.
so, um, having and then already by that time embarked on professional writing, um, I decided that if there ever came a time I would could take on the stories of King Arthur, I would do that. But I knew I wasn't up to up to scratch in that arena. So I that's where Dream Thief and Empyrean came in. It was just a way to not just a way, but it was a way to explore storytelling, to find a voice, to find if I could actually just sit in the chair long enough to do that. And that was the experiment was the Dragon King books that came first, and try to imagine um, what kind of story could be told with this material, you know. But and so yeah, Dragon King was in many ways an experiment, but it worked, and it went through the early process, of course, that all book writers tell you about as they got rejected here and there and everywhere. But finally, a publisher said, "Yeah, we want to publish it," and uh, and then they told me what they're going to pay me for it, which was not enough to pay the water bill. So even a month of it, I said, "Well, um, you know that that's a trilogy, right?" And they said, "Oh, well, we don't know about that." And I said, well, it is. It's the first of three books. And I quickly, off the top of my head, made up two more, and they went for it. And it's thinking on my feet, but also thinking that there's no way this is going to work if this is put in a year's worth of work and get you know
Yeah.
less than less than hourly salary out of it. So so I did that, and they were one of the old style publishers that didn't invest in a book; they invested in a writer, and that's
Mm.
really rare these days. I'm learning it's really more than rare; it's almost impossible. Um,
Yeah.
um, but so they put it out, and then they said, "Well, what else have you got?" So then I wrote Empyrean, and it was during Empyrean, a two-book series. Um, it was conceived as a one giant book, but the publishing economics, uh, like what happened with Tolkien and Lord of the Rings, were such that they couldn't stretch it to justify a big book like that. So it was split up into two, which is
Mm.
fine with me. It got one out there while I was still working on the second one. And was during that, though, publisher actually paid me a visit. And we were living in Lincoln, Nebraska at the time. And we saw this, I showed him the sights of Lincoln, Nebraska. And he's from Chicago. And so I'm sure he's greatly impressed. But we also had a chance to talk about, well, what do you see yourself doing next? And I just floated this idea of King Arthur, and having always wanted to write it. And he said, "Well, you should do it. You should do that." And then we talked about how it'd be done. And he was the kind of publisher who was very not I wouldn't call it hands-on. He was a conceptual editor. He could take an idea and then stretch it. I come to him with this little shriveled idea, and by the time it was over, he stretched it out, a full size in every direction and expanded that. And so that then became the Pendragon cycle. And and with their backing and their blessing, we upped sticks and moved to Britain. And back in the day, you could get a visa for writers and actors and musicians to have, I think, 6 to 9 months visa, to stay in Britain. So we took it and then extended that because by that time I'd finished Taliesin and had begun working on Merlin, and we didn't want to go home. There was just so much uh, material to get through and places to see. I mean, I visited every single location mentioned in the books. I've been there. I've seen the territory, and I studied the history and everything. And the point of that was that I didn't want to retell the stories of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, in their shining armor and everything. I wanted to put the legends back to where they may have actually begun. And that was in a place that at the time nobody was really writing much about. That was post-Roman Britain, which is kind of like I say, back in the time, what was just not a thing, and many other people have done it now. But I had to actually move to Britain to find the materials and the locations and things to make this possible. So what I came up with was kind of, I guess, a hybrid in that the political landscape and the physical landscape, the geography, um, is as close to accurate as I could make it, um, from historical records. And like I said, visiting places and seeing things. But overlaying that was the legend of King Arthur. But what would it have looked like then? Where did it begin? These legends began to take shape, and so that you see their final form, centuries later, um, and it served me well. It gave me a fresh voice. Not everyone was convinced. I know the British publisher who'd become interested by then was involved, and the editor in chief sat me down in the office and said, "Well, what makes you think you can write where so many have written so well before?" Yeah, whoa, that's what we're up against, and that kind of served me warning that I needed to get it right, and I needed to get it to where not only did it serve the legends, but it also served the uh, country of origin too. So anyway, I also decided by then that anything that was French or medieval, I would set that aside off to one side and go there if I needed uh, an incident or an event or something like that. Uh, those kind of later tales could help with, that were part of the legend, but really didn't belong to the time period or the story I was telling. So people will find them in there, but it's not the my aim was not to retell those stories.
Yeah. Boy, that's super interesting. So um I've been aware of the sort of early British or Celtic roots of Arthur, right? So Arthur becomes the British national myth, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Um and but there are sort of Welsh stories. For example, in the Mabinogion, there are, I think,
Mhm.
four of the 11 stories, a medieval collection of Welsh tales, some of which are probably retellings of old Celtic myths, like about gods. But I
Mm.
think four of them are Arthurian, Kilhuch and Olwen, and I forget the other three titles. And so I was curious about this exact thing because, of course, Taliesin is a historical person, or at least there's a name that's attached
Yeah,
to some poems, and I
yeah.
want to say like he's 7th century AD or something. Like he's pretty old. He wrote the Battle of the Trees, right? The Battle of Godolphin, isn't
Yeah,
that?
there are, and that and other scraps of poetry. We call them poetry. Um, Other scraps of verse that he are attributed to him, and yeah, the attributions date from that. But whether he was actually around at that time or just remembered and written down by that time,
Mhm.
that's also an open question. But yeah, from around that time, yeah, sixth century at some point. Yeah, so 500s, something like that. So, um, yeah, he traditionally, I think they think he may come a little bit after the things he's talking about, obviously, but uh, to make him contemporaneous. Um, in my book, see, made a lot of sense as a character to have someone like that. Um, you know, to begin with, and reeling back the tale to, like I said, to the beginning, and um, um, which is Taliesin and Caris, making her the mother of Merlin. What was an idea that I guess it emerged out of some of the tellings, but the Atlantis connection wasn't original with me. People I know scratch their heads about that a lot, but that was actually suggested by another Welsh um, historian and legend hunter who had come across some very obscure, I don't call them manuscripts, but at least uh, I don't know actually what they call them. That they're well, just little squibs of stories that
Mm.
linked the southern part of Britain, which was at one point called Lioness, as we call it, with Atlantis. And he reckoned, as part of his study, that even the word lioness, or in Welsh it'd be Llanys, was an attempt of the British folk to put their tongues around the word Atlantis, and then put that in the into the mix that Atlantis is this island in the middle of the Atlantic. I mean, Atlantic and Atlantis kind of go together, and that it's a sunken island in the Sargasso Sea area, which people do find things there from an earlier civilization. So I just said, okay, I don't have to decide if that's true or not. I'll just steal it
Yeah.
and run with it. So I did, and I took that idea of Atlantis, the land of the ever living. It'd be known as that because they lived, didn't age the way normal mortals did. They belonged to a different earlier race, um, and they had this fabulous, civilization that over centuries and epochs grew smaller and smaller as more of their island, volcanic islands disappeared beneath the waves until the final um, cataclysm takes away all of it. And that was part of the idea that my researcher suggested that um, that southern part of Britain was settled by the survivors, or at least some of the survivors of that cataclysm, and they formed part of the idea of the fair folk in British culture and folklore. And the idea that fairies were little people was a folklore way of saying that this once mighty population had shrunk, not by shrinking them in size. What they were saying in folklore terms, that was actually shrinking the population size. So there are fewer and fewer of them around, and anyway, that's where I came from. So I just took it as a fact and put it into that historical period.
It's so interesting. There is a Welsh folk tale, the Cantre'r Gwaelod, or the Drowned Hundred,
Mm.
that which is an old folk tale about, I think it's about uh, the bay that Cardiff's on, that there used to be a country there and it was completely swallowed by the sea, and that if you I think part of the story is that, like, if the waters are particularly still and there's a moonless night, you can see down and see the houses still down there in the
Yeah,
water.
yeah, yeah.
Um,
You're right, and that, or that sometimes fishermen are out and fishing on that area, and they'll hear bells. It's the bells of old churches and stuff that are drowned. And that's one of them. The one of the early um, heraldic emblems for one family has a man on a horse, and there are waves up around the back of the horse, and he's fleeing the waves. And they think that is that family's history then remembers that event. And so this is someone escaping that drowned country.
yeah.
So
Wow,
yeah.
what a cool bunch of stuff to tap into. Okay, so an old Arthur, a kind of an Arthur, at least akin to the sort of Welsh Arthurs, a Brittonic or a Briton. So is this basically, I mean, I know, well, I know, well, I do know this. So I know that like early versions, an older Celtic language that has now died out, but was closely related to Welsh is Brittonic. And there, for example, the Kingdom of Strathclyde, which straddled what I think we now would call Scotland and kind of northwest England, um, was basically a Celtic-speaking area at one point. And I guess what I've assumed is basically as the Romans retreated, you were probably left with a population that was essentially Celtic, because the Saxons don't come for another 200 years or so, right? With this sort of infusion of Roman culture. Is that kind of, am I getting that right? Is that how we should imagine sort of the historic setting?
Yes and no. Culturally speaking, yes. The idea that there were still a bunch of Italians running around in this country by then is probably a little bit adrift of the mark,
Yeah.
because, um, well, for example, I came across, and here again, this isn't original. All my research is not original. It just I stumble on things and steal them. But um, it was a list of 30 kings, 30 kings names on a written down. Somebody had taken the pains to do that, and yet the historian said, well, that's impossible because there couldn't have been 30 kings in this little territory. I don't forget even where it was, and so they dismissed it until somebody came along later and said, actually, you know what? It's not 30 kings, it's 10 kings. And here's their British name, and here's their Latin name, and here's the name that they were known by in their tribal name. And so it's 10 kings with 3 different names each, but they've lined them out. And so the idea that even though they may have a Roman name or a Latinate name, they still may have been born in Britain. I think by the second, third century, you have the, people who were born and bred in Britain, their families are all born and bred in Britain, but they're living in Roman villas, and they are the magistrates, and they are the, you know, um, filling the government. And and you say as Rome began to leave, well, that didn't really happen in the same way. What happened was that the armies left, and those
Yeah.
armies were made up of British people and others, because the Romans kept, especially some of their units, they kept them on very short leads, so to speak. They would come for a year or two and then rotate out. But there was a constant rotation, the shifting of soldiers all the time, if you're a professional soldier. But a lot of them who were born and bred and grew up in Britain stayed. After their service, they were given land. They settled in the region that they either came from or they found themselves in. And a lot of the early English cities were based around the Roman fortresses and the Roman presence. But the fact that they were second and third generation Brits anyway, and not Italians or foreigners who all of a sudden packed up and went home. That didn't happen.
Yeah.
And
And they
one of the
might
things
even have been,
it indicates that is that even after the legions left, and they didn't leave thinking they were never coming back. They just left to go fight in Germany, because the barbarian invasion by then had depleted so many, and they needed the soldiers in the front line. So they took them from Britain close by, and right away the Brits sent a letter to the emperor: send our soldiers back. You left us defenseless here. And he sent back a letter saying, well, we need them elsewhere. Look to your own defenses. And so that was the beginning of the end in terms of the Roman presence. But Wales, which had a very, very much a significant influence in all that government affairs, held on to their Roman form of government far later than anybody else in Britain. And so while the other regions of Britain, the folk were going back to the tribes and to the old ways of living, they were abandoning the villas and the settlements, the Roman settlements, because they were not able to defend them. They went back to the Iron Age hill forts and things like that they could defend, and they could, live, because they were never very far away from that. And so you find that during that period, the old Iron Age works are being renewed, enlarged, reinforced, and people picking up living there again. So so anyway, that kind of gives you a flavor, but this is the period that Arthur was born into. This is where he came from.
Yeah, it's interesting. The Roman soldier. So Rome at various times had a policy of rewarding veterans with land grants, and if you got a land grant, you didn't get it in Rome. You got it out there on the frontier, and like the whole point of the policy was to spread Romanism, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
And
that happened here a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, and those legionnaires, by the way, might not have been from Italy. They might be from Spain or from Syria or something, right?
They could be, and they could also be just local boys.
Yes, that's it. That's right. This is a good today, right? Who chooses the army for a career? You're a local kid. You don't have great prospects in your small town. The army might be a great way to go. Yeah, so this, and by the way, a young kid in Lincoln, Nebraska, or in Provo, Utah today, might not realize how many. I mean, I lived in England for 5 years myself, so
whereabouts?
Lived a year in London and then 4 years in Guildford.
Oh yeah.
Or two villages outside of Guildford.
Yeah. Well, we know Guildford. We had friends there. Yeah.
Oh yeah. So I'm envisioning. So I Uffington Hill, Uffington Castle, big square ditch and bank on top of a hill, commanding the countryside. When you talk about sort of Iron Age hill forts, right? I can imagine them being abandoned during the presence of the legions, but then, boy, if things got anarchic, if robbers came back, right? Absolutely, that's a place you could go put up a wooden palisade and
exactly right.
I also people who have not spent much time in Britain might not realize how many Roman ruins there are.
Oh yeah, and the weird thing is they still keep finding them.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. The advent of the metal detector has meant that there are hobbyists out there trying to find the next Sutton Hoo, treasure hoard. And much more likely they find a couple of copper denarii and, here was a Roman camp, or here's a piece of a paved street or whatever.
It happens weekly.
Yeah. So there's some pretty cool stuff. So tell me why you start, or maybe not why, but how is it that the Arthur story starts with Taliesin? Taliesin's a poet. Is he a generation or two before Arthur? What's the story here?
Yeah, he is. Taliesin, I hope I'm not giving too much away for people who haven't read it, but on the other hand, the books have been out for 30 years in the thing. So people might guess. Yeah, Taliesin is Merlin's father. And Merlin then becomes deeply enmeshed in the whole Arthurian tradition. But and he helps shepherd the two boys, Aurelius and Uther, into kingship for the defense of Britain. And when that falls apart, he turns to Aurelius's son, Arthur. So he's not directly related to Arthur, but he's directly related to Merlin, who is the biggest influence on Arthur's life. not only preserving it at the beginning, but also nurturing it and maintaining it for that purpose of becoming the High King of Britain.
Yeah. That's fantastic. So Taliesin, so how do you envision him? Because we were talking earlier, and he's a historical name, but I don't know that historically we have much of a biography. Am I right to think we have poems about him?
I don't, well, not about him, but by him.
Just by him.
I think there's a so-called Book of Taliesin, and it's not very enlightening about anything. Like I said, and some of the poems don't make any sense to people reading them these days at all. He's talking about things uh, that, but on the other hand, the legends about him are such that he's the greatest, bard of Britain. And so I started looking into bards. What was that? Well, it was more than a guy who strummed a little harp and sang, nice songs, because bards in his day were a remnant of a huge storehouse of knowledge about everything from astronomy and geology and all kinds of things, to statecraft and dealing with kings. And if you were a bard attached to the court of a king, your job was not only to remember and record all the king's deeds, but to to champion those and to big him up whenever you had a chance. And so, but they also had an aspect of their character that was meant to be prophetic, and so they were able to read omens and read the stars and sort of become give you know there's a big battle coming up, and so you ask the bard to give you a good sign that this is going to be all right. So there's all that going on too, and so of course then you get true prophets and false prophets out of that, and everything. So to be a true bard, um, a true bard of Britain, that was a big deal. He was known to have sound prophecies and good poems and good memory, and he could guide a king as foremost advisor, let's say.
Yeah.
And we're trusted with that.
Yeah. It's like the Irish Olav. He's a character of the court, so he's got like a historian function, maybe a diplomat function, this kind of prophetic role. Super interesting. By the way, this is a word. The word bard illustrates the English language. I forget whose comment it is that English doesn't borrow words from other languages. It hunts other languages down dark alleys, knocks them down, and steals the words from. I'm getting the quote wrong, but it's something like that. But bard is a Welsh word, right?
Yeah.
This is where we got the word. So very cool. So is Taliesin then? Is he sort of? He's kind of he lives in the chaos. He saw the glory of Rome, or maybe he just remembers the glory of Rome because he's of his kind of the poetry and the history in his function, and he's trying to restore that or bring that back.
But put it this way, I put it in, I give it to him as one of his little prophetic songs, and it becomes known as the Dream of Taliesin in the book. But it was a way of envisioning Britain as a kind of a beacon to the rest of the world, a beacon of justice and unity and those kind of things. And so that was the idea that Arthur was, you might say, born to bring about, that age of peace and love and brotherhood throughout the land, and would reign as a righteous king in Britain. And that was the idea of the Dream of Taliesin. And so and Arthur, and even in the other literature, is spoken of as the first Christian king of Britain. And not only was a high king, he was a Christian king. So that had a different kind of connotation, different meaning than it might have to people who say those words now. because it didn't have a sectarian type of attachment. It didn't have any kind of particular theological attachment. What it did have, it owed to the Celtic Church, which was the only church they had. There weren't Catholics here. There were the part of the Celtic Church, which owed its beginning. They felt that their take on Christianity was as old as Rome, and even before, and had before Rome became the church power, the Celts owned it. You know, the Celtic monks and the early saints and the people that are remembered in, well, still around, names of churches and all throughout Britain have Celtic names attached to them, even in France and beyond, because these guys traveled a lot. And so they anyway, that would have had a particular meaning. That's all I'm trying to say, I guess. It would have a particular meaning. It doesn't actually mean what people think it means when they hear those words today, but it has a real deep resonance with areas of the country here still.
Yeah.
And in fact, I think Celtic Christianity has become a fascination for a lot of people because, unlike a lot of other kinds of fashions of, say, Christianity or even history, that it got frozen in time because it was squashed by the Roman Catholic powers that be, and so it kind of preserved it, kind of like the fly in amber sort of thing. It's still a kind of a crystallized form that you can go back to, and you can see what it looked like and see what it was like, and get a picture of it that is quite a bit different than what what expression of the church today. So anyway,
Yeah.
I could go on about the church history too, but it's not about, this isn't about that.
Well, there are so many interesting tangents here, right? And it's
Yeah.
okay. We can talk about anything that's interesting to you. Let's talk a little bit at least about Arthur, and there's of course a little sense in which we're talking spoilers, but if anybody doesn't want spoilers, they can read the books first, and then they can hear the interview afterwards. Well, actually, so why is Merlin's book 2, right? And then Arthur's book 3. So tell me how we get a book 2 of a book of Merlin before we get to Arthur.
Well, being the son of Taliesin and Arthur, when Merlin is born, is not even around yet. He's still a generation away. So, in fact, at the time of Merlin, early on, even Aurelius and Uther are not around yet, and they're brothers, by the way. Two different mothers, but the same father. So anyway, and that is explained in the new book, Aurelia, how that all came about. That's her story. She is both the stepmother of Aurelius and the mother of Uther, and her story is told in Aurelia. But the story of Merlin, he's very separate from all that, and he grows up in kind of as half and half. He's half fair folk on his mother's side, and he's British on his father's side, that is to say, mortal. But he inherits the fair folk genetic anti-aging gene or whatever it is that makes them, people around them think they live forever. Well, they don't, but in the sense that they just age so much more slowly. Their lives are so much longer. Everything else passes around them, and people living think they must be immortal. And so Merlin inherits that. So he's around for a long time, and he has various trials and tribulations he goes through to make him who he is. But one of the earliest references to Merlin say, and Merlin was ruling the proud South Welsh in those days as king, prophet, and lawgiver. Well, that's interesting. That's 3 different aspects.
Mm-hmm.
So I hadn't heard that he had been a king before. So I said, okay, that's one phase of his life. Prophet is another one. Lawmaker is another whole area. Talks about that, speaks of the statescraft and the, power behind the throne sort of thing. So I thought, well, let's explore that. And so those became the divisions in the book Merlin, to show how each of those things happened, where they came from, and what happened to him that made him give up being a king to become a prophet and lawgiver instead. And
Yeah.
anyway, yeah. So people find that out in Merlin.
Fantastic. We're 2 books in. We don't even get to Arthur. So it is. Tell us about this Arthur then. So the land connection. This is the fair folk, right?
Yeah.
This comes through Merlin. This probably. I mean, does he have technologies that cause him to be or understanding or science that cause him to be perceived as a magician? Is that the sort of um, implementation of that?
Well, that I think is a medieval expression. Merlin magician is an expression of, I don't know what you might call it, the reverence, but also the awe that these bards were held in at a later age. So that medieval conception is that, well, they must have been magicians working this magic. They could do these things, But actually, those have been kind of in his bardic training, and in Taliesin or in Merlin, we show where that comes from, who trained him that way and what the things he could do. And so a lot of things that were later thought of as magic were mainly expected, out of the bag of tricks, so to speak, that a normal bard would have. The way they could interpret signs and the way they could, foresee things, and the different mechanisms that they used for, I wouldn't say fortune telling, but it comes across that way. That they were expected to be able to perform.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Interesting. So, so Arthur is book 3. Um, is there a round table? Do we have a Guinevere? Tell us about the Arthur as you tell him in this book.
Well, in this book, I have to say too that the reason it's called the Pendragon Cycle is because it was originally conceived as 4 books. So book 2 of Arthur would have included um, the round table ideas and all that kind of thing, up to including his disappearance and from the island and also from the legend. But after Taliesin, and I was in the middle of writing Arthur, and by that time we had moved to England permanently, and that was going great guns, and things were working along. But the publisher decided that didn't really have the kind of uptake that they wanted for the series, and so they said, well, we're going to have to quit at 3.
Oof.
And I said, well, but I'm only half the way through the first one. What am I going to do? Well, you know, um, that's the breaks, kid. Roll with the punches. So I did finish up Arthur using a lot of the material that would have been in book 4, hadn't been written yet. So I was able to do that. So it comes off a little one-sided that way. But it wasn't until a few years later, a new publisher came along and said, well, that cycle thing, we want to finish it. And so I said, okay, well, that becomes then, uh, Pendragon, and Avalon. So, Pendragon and Grail. And they quickly agreed that would be the way to go. And so I was able to finish it. So I had to finish it up in kind of a lumpy fashion with Pendragon, but Pendragon has got a lot of the material that about the round table, about the things that follow on after Arthur becomes king.
Yeah. Yeah. Fantastic. Steve, that's super interesting.
I think sometimes people don't understand. I mean, readers, and there's no reason why they should, but the mechanics of publishing often get in the way of storytelling. So, so,
Oh,
so
100%.
why is Imperium only 2 books and not 3, and why is a cycle of 3 books not a trilogy? And all that kind of thing. So it's mechanics,
Yeah,
economics.
I no, I think that's been one of the fascinating things you've shared with us here is yeah, there's the creative work, right? There's the also making sure I can pay the bills work, and then there's the can the can I or can the publisher afford to put out the books in the way they were meant to or the way I would like to? And
Yeah.
yeah, writing careers are very zigzag sometimes in the way they play out. Um, I'm glad you got to come back to it though, and write those books 4 and 5 too.
Well, I am
Um,
too, and then even more was one, so that becomes Avalon, which is a different. It's kind of the rest of the tale, um, dealing with the return of Arthur. Once and future king. Well, what's the future one look like? And so that becomes Avalon.
yeah, yeah, fantastic. Well, Steve, we will have you back to talk about Aurelia specifically, which is the new addition to the total cycle. Is there anything else you think we should have told readers? Would you like to tell readers about the 3 books that we haven't?
Well, like I said, they've been out quite a while, in terms of readership. I think it's all in the books, and I've said most of everything I have to say about the conception and everything about it, but the rest is in the books. And so if it rouses any curiosity about people who maybe have seen these books on other shelves before and wondered what it was about, it would give them an idea and a reason to go and check it out further.
Yeah, 100%. Well, so the books are Taliesin, Merlin, and Arthur, out now in trade paper and also ebook, wherever books and ebooks are sold. Ebooks, of course, are always DRM free if you buy them at Bain.com. Steve, thanks so very much for joining us today. Look forward to talking to you again soon.
Dave, it was a very much a pleasure, and we'll talk to you again.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Now we continue the final chapter of Wen Spencer's Tinker, Part 84. Girl genius Tinker lives in a near-future Pittsburgh where she runs her salvage business, pays her taxes, and tries to keep the local ambient level of magic down with gadgets of her own design. Life as she knows it takes a serious detour, and she's faced with many distractions just as she really wants to focus on what's important, her first date.
There was a sweep of headlights on the far side of the bridge, and the Sakasha spilled out of 2 of the rolls and charged across the bridge. Windwolf flinging lightning bolts, the arrival of the Sakasha, and their own lord dead made the Oni flee into the forest. The Sakasha met no resistance as they passed beyond Windwolf's protection. Only when the Sakasha had set up a line of defense did Windwolf loose his hold on the magic, letting it drain away. He triggered a light orb as he walked to her, bathing them in light. People surrounded them, but he seemed to be the only one in focus. "You're alive, my most wonderful, clever little savage." He lightly traced her face. She'd never seen him smile so widely. He blinked away a thread of tears and glanced toward the waiting Sakasha. "I must go and fight, but I will be back." "Kiss me at least once," she complained. "If I start, I will not be able to stop." "Bullshit." She grabbed hold of his collar and pulled him down to her level. He hadn't been exaggerating. Someone had to catch the light orb. He let it fall in order to crush her to him, and she had to finally push him breathlessly away after the third Dameze, the Oni, from the Sakasha. "Go," she said. "Deal with the Oni. Come back to me." He kissed her fingertips and reluctantly left to chase after the Oni. Tinker slumped down beside Pony, quite willing to let them fight without her. "Domi?" Pony croaked. "Oh, good." She took his hand. "You're awake?" "Yes." He frowned as she checked his attempt to get up. "Is it over? Did we win?" "Yes, we've won." Hospice elves arrived, first aid kits in hand. "Domi, are you hurt?" No, see to him first," Tinker lied, motioning to Pony. There were, however, more than enough healers to treat them both. One inked a healing spell onto her side and triggered it, while the rest dealt with Pony. In the desperate fight, he'd been hit more times than she realized. As the healers stabilized him, Enclave elves moved into the forest to deal with the Oni dead. Sparrow's body was found and carried to the Enclaves, along with news of her betrayal. Apparently, in an effort to keep searchers from the Turtle Creek area, the female had planted evidence in the South Hills, articles of Tinker's clothing, items from Tinker's pockets, Pony's beads, scraps of paper with Tinker's handwriting. Windwolf and his forces had been at the farthest point in Pittsburgh from Tinker when she escaped, but the reports of gunfire at the construction site had brought Windwolf literally flying back, out ahead of his bodyguard, to save her. The fighting had now moved far off, heading back toward Turtle Creek. Tinker could track it from the sound of gunfire and the occasional bright strokes of lightning. "That is so cool. I'm really going to have to learn how to do that." Or did she? Now that she was once again still, she could feel the feedback, definitely stronger. According to the models she ran, the orbital gate would soon shake itself to pieces, permanently returning Pittsburgh to Earth. Which world did she want to be in? Earth? With oil can lane, all the neat gadgets, the internet, colleges full of like-minded people, and the possibility of returning to Elfhome any time she decided to build a gate back? Or Elfhome, with Windwolf and Pony, but no humans or techno-toys, and the grim possibility that even if she could find the supplies, she might be denied the permission to build a gate back to Earth. On the surface, all logic seemed to say that she should get up and walk into Pittsburgh proper before shutdown. Go back to Earth. But it wasn't that simple. In truth, she'd never been to Earth. Every shutdown, she'd clung to her scrapyard and waited for startup. She disliked the dirty air, the noise, the confusion, and the crush of people that shutdown brought to Pittsburgh. Oil Can, who knew her best, predicted she'd hate Earth for those very reasons. It was a foreign, other place she always resisted visiting. Becoming an elf didn't make Elfhome her home. It only strengthened her tie to it. She grew up praying to elfin gods, practicing elfin morals, and celebrating elfin holidays. What did she know about being human besides beer, bowling, junked cars, and advanced science?
This has been the Bane Free Radio Hour. Thanks for joining us at the heart of science fiction. Join us next week on the Bane Free Radio Hour when Dave Butler interviews Stephen R. Lawhead again on his newest entry in the Arthurian fantasy series, The Pendragon Cycle, with the prequel, Aurelia. And Tinker by Wen Spencer continues in part 85. Score by Ruth Judkowitz.